Weapons in Siege are a controversial topic to say the least, and balancing them can be an absolute nightmare for developers. There are two main balancing philosophies that a developer can use to deal with issues with balancing. They can choose to mainly focus on buffing weak guns to make them competitive with strong weapons, or they can prioritize nerfing weapons that are strong to keep them in check. If you've been playing Siege for a while, you'll likely realize that Ubisoft tends to have an issue with mainly subscribing to the latter. This has resulted in some weapons falling off drastically, and it's also caused a sentiment in the community to be spread that Ubisoft has targeted popular weapons with too many nerfs. So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you some of the most glaring examples of these, and I'll be giving you my opinion on whether I think these nerfs were warranted, because as you all know, if anyone's got an opinion, it's me. Now let's go ahead and answer the question, what is Rainbow Six Siege's most nerfed weapon? Now, for the sake of today's video, let's start off with some of the nerfs to weapons that are the most known and talked about. I think one of the earliest examples of Ubisoft meaningfully nerfing a weapon was in Operation Red Crow, where they removed the ACOG from the SMG-11. The SMG-11 was a strong secondary weapon due to its high fire rate and its low recoil, and people were using it to spawn peek at the time, so Ubisoft removed the ACOG to stop it from being used that way. Personally, I know a lot of people may look back on this with nostalgia, but this was a necessary and good nerf in my opinion. Having an operator have access to a secondary weapon with an ACOG on it that can easily be used to take long-range gunfights is just not good for the game's balancing. And this nerf would lead to a philosophy in Siege where Ubisoft wanted to stop non-3 armor defenders from having magnification sights. The next example of them following this philosophy was in Blood Orchid, where they removed Bandit's MP7 ACOG. The MP7 was a strong gun. It had a fast fire rate, solid damage, and the recoil was minimal. Combining this with the ACOG made this weapon dominate, and with spawn peaks becoming a more hot button topic, Ubisoft felt that the ACOG needed to be removed. I tend to agree with this nerf for that reason. In this same update though, Ubisoft would remove the ACOG off of Jaeger's 416C carbine. And while I agree with removing the weapon sight, Ubisoft would go overboard and continue to nerf the weapon after this change. The reason is because Jaeger was by far the most used operator on the defense. People loved running him for his gun, and his gadget was one of the strongest ever. So Ubisoft would decide to focus on his gun with the balancing changes, which I feel was a mistake. They would do this by nerfing his gun's damage from 42 to 38 in shifting tides, and then nerfing the recoil of his weapon and nerfing his magazine capacity by 5 bullets in Crimson Heist. These changes just stacked onto each other, and it made Jaeger's weapon really bad compared to other guns on the defense. The gun's recoil was jumpy, its damage was below average, and it didn't have the ACOG like it did before. These nerfs still affect Jaeger today, where his gun holds him back from competing with Wamai at the highest level. I definitely think that Jaeger could get his ACOG back nowadays because of how bad the rest of his stats are, especially since nowadays it comes with a drawback of slower ADS speeds. Another gun that lost its ACOG that would result in a snowball of more nerfs coming its way was Ash's R4C in Burnt Horizon. This ACOG removal was just plain stupid. Ash is obviously an attacker, so in my opinion, removing the ACOG wasn't necessary, which is why she likely has one nowadays. But they would also nerf her recoil significantly in high caliber, and they would also nerf her weapon's magazine capacity by 5 bullets in twin shells. As I'm sure you can see by now, there tends to be a pattern with Ubisoft balancing that results in a lot of weapons being in significantly worse state. I don't necessarily disagree with the current state of the R4C now that it has an ACOG. I just don't see what made them think she warranted a nerf like this when everything about her except her gun were kind of middling. Now, while a lot of the nerfs we have discussed so far were significant, I don't necessarily think they completely broke the weapons balance they targeted. Some may have gone a little far, but the guns were still playable. However, there are far more significant nerfs that we have yet to discuss. The first example of one of these extreme weapon nerfs was when Ubisoft started targeting the Scorpion Evo available on Ella. This weapon released with a stupid fast fire rate, low recoil, and a nearly endless magazine. So Ubisoft definitely needed to fix this, but I think they went too far. They would nerf the gun's recoil multiple times throughout multiple updates. They would nerf its magazine capacity by 10 in Operation White Noise, and they would nerf the gun's damage by 5 in Operation Chimera. The magazine capacity nerf and the damage nerf was justified, and I think good changes. However, after Ubisoft's countless recoil nerfs to her, her gun became nearly uncontrollable. The horizontal recoil was insane, and it made many people just stop playing her. Ubisoft would go back and make her recoil more controllable many updates later, but it was too late since people had already written her off. I think if Ubisoft just decided to nerf the Scorpion's damage and magazine, Ella would have been in a lot more of a healthy place, and they wouldn't have to go back and buff the gun so many times to make it viable like we're dealing with today. Now, a weapon nerf that many people forget about that is arguably one of the biggest nerfs in the game ever is the Louison. This was Caveira's special sidearm that allowed her to down opponents to interrogate them, but Ubisoft felt the weapon released in too strong of a state due to it being able able to consistently two-shot and occasionally one-shot opponents. So they would start out by increasing the damage drop-off in Red Crow drastically, and then they would go further by nerfing the gun's damage from 99 to 65 in Wind Bastion. This was a massive change. The Louison went from the highest damage gun in the game with a stupid far range for a handgun that could easily down an attacker into a handgun that was just kind of middling. Caveira was bad before this nerf, and she is still bad today for reasons outside of her handgun, but the nerf was still major, and it is the largest drop in a gun's damage in the game's history. I think the damage of 99 was an issue, and I think the nerf was a good change. However, they should have buffed her in other aspects to make her gadget and overall kit more viable at the same time. Another weapon that saw a major damage nerf in a similar vein that I think was affected way worse was the TCSG. This slug shotgun was dominating on its release. It had an ACOG, low recoil, and it didn't really have a severe damage drop-off. This allowed it to function as somewhat of a defensive DMR that packed a heavy punch. So Ubisoft would levy mini nerfs towards it. The first major one was in Operation Void Edge, where they would nerf the damage of the TCSG from 84 to 57, massively reducing its damage. This would have an effect on the gun's popularity initially, but I still think the nerf was necessary because the initial damage of the gun being 84 was way too high. But additional ADS nerfs would also hurt the gun drastically as well. They have buffed the gun's damage back up to 63 more recently, which I think is more reasonable, but the gun definitely needed a damage nerf from its launch damage for sure. Now, arguably one of the most infamous and dirtiest gun nerfs was the nerf to Mozzie's P10 Ronin. The reason this gun was targeted was because the gun's popularity exploded, and it was mainly due to its low recoil and access to the 1.5, which allowed players to hit easy headshots. This led to big names in the community, including pro players, asking for the P10 Ronin to lose its 1.5, specifically on Mozzie. However, Ubisoft would decide to go down a different route and would instead remove 5 bullets from the P10 Ronin's magazine in Crystal Guard. This was a universally hated decision. Players across all skill levels disliked this, and it made the gun significantly more difficult to use, since you only had 15 bullets per magazine to take a gunfight with. And trying to take a gunfight against multiple opponents with that magazine is extremely difficult. I do think that the P10 Ronin needed a nerf, but I also think they should have gone with the nerf the community actually wanted, the removal of the 1.5. I think this is because nowadays the P10 Ronin doesn't have access to a 1.5, and now it's having to suffer from that 5 bullet reduction, which is causing many players to just not run the P10 Ronin altogether. So I think they shouldn't have removed the 5 bullets in the long run and should have instead just removed the 1.5 from the get-go. The decision to nerf the magazine capacity of the P10 Ronin was just too damaging to the weapon's effectiveness, in my opinion. However, I think the gun that matches the title of today's video the most would be the F2. That is because of the multitude of nerfs thrown its way that took it from one of the best guns in the game to an extremely difficult weapon to use pretty much overnight. The first nerf would come in Operation Parabellum, where Ubisoft would reduce the damage of the F2 by 3. Then they would nerf the recoil of the F2 significantly in Operation Phantom Sight. Following that up, they would then, once again, nerf the gun's magazine by 5 bullets in Operation Emberise. All of this happened in a short window, and it very quickly became apparent that Ubisoft was targeting this weapon, and it wasn't unwarranted. The F2 had become a monster, and many players used it as a crutch to win gunfights since its DPS was insane, its recoil was low, and it had access to the best weapon sights in the game. You really couldn't go wrong with the gun, and people were only picking Twitch for that reason. They chose her to frag out, and the drones were kind of an afterthought. So these nerfs I think were justified, and they honestly could have gone further. However, I think their decision to remove the F2's vertical grip in Solar Raid was where things really got out of hand. The reason for this is because there was now no way to deal with the ridiculous recoil of the F2, so the gun was basically unusable for the average player. This was just not an intuitive nerf. Instead of nerfing the F2 in a way where the gun was still usable but just more balanced, Ubisoft instead just decided to completely remove the ability for most of the player base to use it. It also didn't make sense because Ubisoft had just recently been universalizing attachments to all guns to make them consistent, and now they were removing an attachment typically available to all weapons from the F2. This was a ridiculous balancing decision, and it has left the F2 in such a state where people are using her 417 DMR over her F2. Keep in mind, the F2 used to be the undisputed best gun in the game, but it just isn't close anymore, mainly because of this nerf and others mentioned before, which is why I would argue the F2 is Siege's most nerfed gun. But you could make the argument for some of the other weapons I mentioned in this video. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video answering the question, what is Rainbow Six Siege's most nerfed weapon? If you did, I make Siege content just like this twice a week, so go subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter if you don't want to miss the next upload. Also, if you think I missed a weapon or if you disagree with my selection, make sure to leave yours in the comments down below. Now, if you want to watch another video just like this one, a video will be popping up on your screen right now that I'm sure you all enjoy. I'll see you next time, friends, and peace.